very much for coming and making me do this. It actually forced me to integrate a whole lot of different things that we have been doing in the last 7 years or so. So I'm just going to kind of tell you why we started doing this work, some of the theories behind working memory literature, and how it applies to bilingualism, and then I'll show you a whole lot of our data, and maybe you can help me think through it, because we're still not quite sure what to do with some of it. So I'm just going to start by saying thanks to a whole lot of people who contributed to the work I'll be talking about in various ways. The person that's really important is Ji-won Yu, who is my graduate student, who has collected all of the adult data that I will be showing you today. And it's on Korean English bilingual, so if you have any questions about the stimuli, I'm not the person to ask, but I'll do my best. So this is what I'm thinking that we can do today. So I'm going to share with you some of the models of working memory that are used most frequently in the field to think about what it is and what it does. And then I'm going to shift over to what we know about how working memory functions in the bilingual mind. And we'll start by telling you that there's actually, first of all, very little data on bilingual working memory function. And the data that we do have are very, very inconsistent and conflict quite a bit across different studies. And so, you know, the things that matter in terms of some of the inconsistencies are obviously issues of language proficiency. So bilinguals who know languages to different degrees will do different things on working memory tasks, but there are also some things that we don't think about as often, and it has to do with just how linguistic your task is, and how difficult your task is, and how old are the people who are doing your tasks. And so those are the things that I think matter. And so then what I'll do is tell you about some of the data in the verbal memory domain, and how it works in bilingual versus monolingual individuals, adults versus children, and then some of the nonverbal working memory literature, which if you do language research, you don't necessarily think about nonverbal memory, like memory for visual stuff or spatial stuff, but it's actually important, and I'll tell you why. And then lastly, I'll talk about the things that we probably all care about the most, and that's the role of working memory in language acquisition and language processing, and some ways to get at it in bilinguals, and why the traditional way of getting at it in monolinguals may not actually work for bilinguals, and L2 speakers in particular. So that's where I'm kind of going. We'll see what happens. All right, so let me just kind of tell you why we started doing this work. Because when I started doing this work, I wasn't actually interested in working memory at all. What I was interested in was learning. I was interested in how individuals acquire new information, linguistic, non-linguistic, and whether being bilingual actually in some ways makes your learning mechanisms more efficient. And you know, we started doing this work for various reasons, but when we did, we realized that in order to make meaningful comparisons between bilinguals and monolinguals, to say, oh, bilinguals are better at learning or not better at learning, you needed to equate your group on all kinds of measures that go into learning, right? So we all do this, right? When we compare two groups of individuals and we're interested in one particular aspect of their performance, we need to make sure that all the other stuff is controlled and equal and even, or at least measured and then factored out. And when you do learning work, working memory becomes really important, right? Because learning is actually very much an offshoot of your ability to maintain information in memory. However you think about learning, that's always the necessary step. And so we said, okay, we need to measure working memory somehow and make sure that our bilinguals and monolinguals don't differ on working memory measures, right? So that's where we started, and it was like an easy thing. We thought we'll just do this one working memory task, make sure that we don't get differences between bilinguals and monolinguals, and we'll be good to go. And little did I know that like 7 years later, I'd actually be working on working memory proper. So let me just kind of then set this up. So if some of this is like totally trivial and you know all of this, just wave, and then I'll kind of move along. So there's actually a whole lot of debate as to what working memory is and what the models of working memory are, what the structure of working memory is, and what the function of working memory is. So these three ways of thinking about working memory are actually probably the most prevalent ones in the field that focuses on working memory as the sort of the goal of research. There's lots of other theories of working memory that see it as just a subcomponent of attention control or executive function, but these are the ways of thinking about working memory by people who study working memory, right? So that model, this one, is probably the one that you're most familiar with, right? So this is the classic Baddeley and Hitch tripartite working memory model. A lot of people situate their work within this theoretical view, right? And the idea here is that basically in order to perform a cognitive task, you need to maintain certain information relevant to that task in some sort of a temporary buffer, right, that gives you access to that information for a brief period of time, right? And that's the idea behind short-term memory, right? Your short-term memory is basically a storage system that acts as a cognitive buffer between the very noisy environment and your brain, right? And the idea is that it's capacity constrained. There's only that much information that you can fit into it. It's very short term, right? So information is in there for a very brief period of time, and it either gets eliminated if it's irrelevant or unnecessary, or you need to do something with it if you want to keep it for longer, right? So it's basically a buffer between the world and your long-term memory where all of your knowledge is stored. And the idea is that different kinds of information are actually stored in different storage systems, right? So if you are listening to someone talk and you need to remember what they're saying, it's all going to go into your phonological loop. This is the verbal memory storage, right? And then you would rehearse it, right? You somehow re-articulate it to yourself if you want to maintain it, or it goes away, right? A phone number, right? If you want to remember it, you need to say it to yourself a few times. We don't actually do that anymore, do we? But you have to do it if you want to remember it. If you don't, you'll hear it, and 3 to 5 seconds later, it's just going to disappear from your mind, right? The idea then is that visual and spatial information get encoded by the visual spatial sketchpad. This is sort of the nonverbal correlate of the phonological loop. So if you're looking at maps, right, and you're trying to remember where things are on the map, that's your visual spatial sketchpad doing the work, right? And again, very limited capacity, very short term. And so the original model included these two short-term storage kind of modules, and it always included something called the central executive, which has always actually remained the most mysterious aspect of this model. No one actually agrees on what it does. In Baddeley's initial conceptualization of it, all he said was that the central executive basically controls the function of the two storage systems, right? And you can think of it as, you know, if you know the terminology, the supervisory attentional system, central executive, executive control, focused attention, attention deployment, cognitive capacity, they all are part of the central executive. The idea is that in some ways it's actually not specific to modality, right? It basically supervises the function of the phonological loop, right? So if you need to focus on the verbal task at hand, the central executive basically sends all of your attentional resources to the phonological loop. If you're trying to encode a map, the central executive is going to throw all of its resources behind visual spatial processing, right? And then over the last 30 or 40 years or so, this model got refined and added to, and so this is the modern version of the model. And what you can see is that they've added a few things. So one of the things that's been crucial is the addition of this gray box. So you see this little gray thing? That's actually long-term memory. So at some point, the Baddeley team has realized that encoding of novel information is very much a function of what the system already knows, right? That your knowledge actually very much matters for what you can encode. In the simplest terms, for instance, it's much easier to remember real words than made up words, right? And it's not the phonological loop, because the phonological loop is not semantically constrained. It's just a verbal, auditory, or visual encoding mechanism. Where it matters is that the words are actually represented in your long-term knowledge. And so the knowledge of words can help you remember words. But your knowledge of words cannot help you remember made-up words, or at least not as much. And so work like that has actually prompted the Baddeley team to say, okay, long-term memory really matters, right? It actually very much interacts with the function of the phonological loop for verbal encoding, and visual spatial knowledge, right? Very much matters in your ability to actually remember visual spatial information. So that was the first thing that they did. And then the second thing that they did is they added something called the episodic buffer, which is the second least known and understood aspect of this model after the central executive. No one actually kind of knows what it does. The reason why they proposed it is because at some point a whole lot of experiments have shown that the functions of the visual spatial sketchpad and the phonological loop are not entirely independent. And so they needed some way of actually integrating verbal and visual and spatial information, and the episodic buffer enables you to do that, right? So this model is very well known, very well established. A lot of people who study working memory base their research within this model. The model that's often contrasted with it, or has been for the last 20 years or so, is Nelson Cohen's model, and it's the model down here. So the main difference between the two models is in the extent to which working memory is seen as a separate cognitive mechanism in the mind. So in Baddeley's conceptualization, it's a separate thing. It's by itself, it functions, it's related to working memory, to long-term knowledge and central executive, but it is its own cognitive system, right? In Nelson Cohen's perception of it, it isn't. All working memory is just long-term memory that's activated temporarily for a particular purpose, right? And so for Nelson Cohen, basically working memory is just an offshoot of focused attention being in service of some long-term representations that you need for a particular task at hand, right? So the idea is that, say a digit span task, which is a very famous, right, verbal memory task, you hear a series of numbers and you need to recall them, right? In Baddeley's conceptualization, that's your phonological loop doing the work. In Nelson Cohen's conceptualization, digits get activated in long-term memory because they're represented there, and then attention gets focused on them and you maintain them for a brief period of time. When you no longer need them, they seep back down to your long-term system, right? And for a very long time, that difference between the two models was actually very meaningful, because Baddeley's model for a very long time didn't actually involve long-term knowledge at all, right? But it was Nelson Cohen's work that actually prompted them to add the long-term memory to their model. And so at this point, the two yield very similar predictions as to how people will perform working memory tasks. A very radical approach to working memory was actually, it's not a theoretical model so much as a computational one, was proposed by the MacDonald and Christensen, and this was about 15 years ago, where they said there is no such thing as working memory, and working memory has nothing to do with attention. Basically, all it is knowledge being activated by contextual information. And so it's sort of a very radical way of thinking about working memory as just a non-existent sort of construct. They think of working memory as something that's not separable from your knowledge of the language, right? Any questions so far? Does it kind of make sense where we are?
About the code. So how would the temporal aspect work? Because, for example, in a digit span, you need to give digits back in the same or the opposite order in which you got them. So how would the focused attention deal with that aspect of things?
Exactly the same way that it would in Baddeley's model. I mean, mechanistically, they don't actually differ. Yeah. So you basically say, you know, you hear a series of digits, right? They get activated in your long-term memory. Some attention needs to be deployed to maintain these digits, right, for a brief period of time.
And part of their activation codes the order in which they work.
Exactly, and serial order basically gets encoded the same way as everything else gets encoded.
Well, in the phonological loop, I think the
Is
serial
this-
order is it's more.
Exactly, yeah,
Okay.
yeah. So in terms of kind of theories, right, these two, they look very different, right? Like structurally, they look very different, but functionally, at this point, they are very similar. They actually make very similar predictions as to working memory performance. There's different, you know, there are different ways of thinking about this as well, which I'm gonna start kind of bringing in as I lay out the data. But these are really the two big ones. So, you know, the way that people typically think of working memory tasks, and this is true independent of which theory you like better. Most people who do this work will tell you that it's very important to think about memory tasks in two categories, right? So people will make a distinction between short-term memory tasks and working memory tasks, right? And this is true independent of whether you're a Baddeley, you know, boy or girl, or a Nelson Cohen boy or girl. So the idea is that the short-term memory tasks are tasks that are requiring you to store information and nothing else, right? So classic tasks like the digit span or the counting span or letter span or non-word repetition or word span where you hear a list of words and you need to retrieve them in the same order that you heard them. All you need to do is you need to listen to the information or see it, right? Store it for a brief period of time and then spit it back out. You don't need to do anything with that information. So tasks like this are very classic verbal short-term memory tasks. In Baddeley's conceptualization, they are a function of the phonological loop. In Nelson Cohen's conceptualization, these are temporarily activated things in your language knowledge system that don't require you to pay much attention to them, right? And so, you know, tasks like this have been used very, very frequently, and they are contrasted with working memory tasks. Now, the crucial difference between short-term memory and working memory is that working memory tasks require you to actually do some cognitive processing on the information that you're trying to maintain in memory. So the idea is that you're not just storing information, you're actually using it and are doing mental operations on it for a particular purpose, right? So a contrast that's easy to make is one between the forward digit span and the backward digit span, right? That's a very famous way to think about it. So in the forward digit span, you recall the digits in the same order as you've heard them. In the backward digit span, you do it in the opposite order. And the difference is that for the backward digit span, you need to take in the information, but then you need to reorganize it and spit it back out in the reverse order. And that need to reorganize means that you're actually engaging in cognitive processing over and above the storage that's required. And so tasks like the backward digit span, any kind of a dual task where your primary task is to maintain verbal information in mind while at the same time engaging in some other processing. Operation span is a very famous version of a working memory task where you see words or you hear words, and between presentations of words you need to solve math equations, right? Reading span is another one that's used a lot, where you see sentences and you read them out loud, or you make grammaticality judgments on them, or you make truth-false judgments on them, and at the same time you're remembering the last word of each sentence, and then you have to recall these words in a particular order. So you can see how it's very systematic, right? So anytime you're forcing the mind to encode information and store it, but also do something else with it, right? That's working memory. And structurally speaking, the difference between these two types of tasks in the classic Baddeley conceptualization is that short-term memory tasks tap the phonological loop, whereas the working memory tasks tap the phonological loop and the central executive, right? And so in the verbal domain, I think you probably are very familiar with these. I don't know how familiar you are with this in the nonverbal domain, but there's actually quite a lot of literature using this same distinction to talk about short-term memory, visual spatial tasks, and working memory, visual tasks. So these are just two examples of nonverbal memory tasks, right? So the first one is called the Corsi blocks. We use it a lot with kids. It's a spatial task. The way that it works is that you see locations on the computer screen that light up in a particular order, and then at recall, a child has to point to these locations on the screen in the same order as they've seen them, right? Short-term memory task, right? Spatial span type tasks. This is an example of a visual short-term memory task. This is actually a very famous paper by Locke and Vogel. For anyone who's interested in visual memory, it's like a classic. They basically were the first ones to introduce a visual short-term memory task, and it's a color span task. So you see these colored squares on the computer screen for a brief period of time. Then you see another display that's either exactly the same as the one you saw, or it differs in the color of one of the squares, and all you have to do is say, are they the same or are they different, right? And it's tasks like this that actually told us that the capacity of the visual memory system is actually quite different from the capacity of the verbal memory system. So I'm sure you're familiar with the 7 plus or minus 1, right, idea. This famous Miller equation, right? So you can maintain 7 verbal items in your short-term memory at any one time, which is why phone numbers apparently are 7 digits long or fewer. This work actually suggested that the visual short-term memory capacity is 4 items plus or minus 1. That's actually been debated quite a bit lately, but this was the work that kind of put a start to that idea that capacity limitations actually work quite differently depending on the modality. Rama, do you have
See how the color task is totally visual and does not involve language, but to me the upper task, when I try to understand, involve language. So do you see any difference between these two tasks, although you call both of them nonverbal?
That's actually a really excellent question. So one of the things that we always struggle with is the extent to which you can actually create a nonverbal task, period, right? So even tasks, these are nameable colors, right? So one way to actually remember this is to look at this and say yellow, blue, green, red, black, pink, right? And then at the next trial, you'll say, oh, one of them is white. That wasn't the one I saw. It's different. You can also say that the Corsi blocks work exactly the same way. Like you could look at these squares, generate numbers for these squares, right? And basically say, okay, I'm going to call that top one a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and I'm going to remember digits as opposed to locations. And all I can say to that is that you can do your best to make a task as non-linguistic as you can possibly make it, but the fact of the matter is that humans use language strategically to remember everything. And so the extent to which you can actually take the language out of the equation completely is a huge, huge issue. And I'm not sure it's ever possible to do that completely.
As far as I remember, one of the papers I read is that there's a point of age here. So when you give children stimulus which are visually similar, they will do, for example, knife or pen, they will do better with similarities. They are more tuned to the visual similarities, and they are less tuned to the phonological similarities.
That's exactly right. Yeah. So there are developmental considerations in play. There are also language ability considerations in play. So for instance, typically developing children one argument is that the difference between typically developing children and atypically developing children is that typically developing kids can use language strategically to solve seemingly non-linguistic tasks, whereas children with language impairments do not. The separation of visual from verbal systems actually came about because they did these dual task articulatory suppression experiments in the 70s and the 80s, where they showed that if your primary task is a verbal task and your secondary task is also a verbal task, it's going to interfere much more than if the secondary task is a visual processing task, and vice versa. And so to an extent, the suggestion is that, verbal memory and visual spatial memories are separable to that extent. But as with everything in the working memory world, it's all a matter of degrees. And I'm going to show you that in probably about an hour and a half. Yeah. So, it's an excellent question. I'm actually not convinced that one can ever take the language out of the equation. But what one can do is say, I'm going to present stimuli that are not easily nameable, or that are not easily verbalizable, or that maybe do not have clear linguistic correlates. So one of the things that they've done in this visual kind of colors paradigm is they actually use colors that don't have easy names in English, right? So you can imagine putting in colors that are not primary colors, like fuchsia and aquamarine or whatever. You wouldn't probably.
We don't have them.
Yeah.
Yeah, but then you just call it green and pink.
Exactly. So, individual strategy will always trump whatever you as the experimenter think you're doing. And so,
But at least, I guess, at least these tasks don't present the linguistic
that's
information.
exactly right.
So the linguistic labels are internally generated
That's
and
right.
can vary between individuals
That's
based on
That's
their.
exactly right. Yeah. Which creates its own issues, because then individual variability may be driven not by what you think you're manipulating, but by the fact that different people use different strategies to solve your problem. And so, when you apply that to bilingualism research, which I will show you in just a second, that it becomes really complicated. But the difference between short-term and working memory is very well established in the nonverbal domain as well. So this is an example of spatial working memory task. And you can see that in its conceptualization, it's very similar to the Corsi blocks. So there are locations that are predefined, and they light up in a particular order, and you need to remember the order. And the difficulty level is manipulated by increasing, right, the number of locations that you need to maintain in memory. But in between the presentation stimulus and your sort of performance stimulus, people have to solve some sort of a spatial judgment task. So in this case, you make a symmetry judgment. You decide whether that intervening stimulus, this one, is actually symmetrical or not. Right? And so the idea is that you're involved in some sort of a secondary spatial processing task, and this makes it a working memory measure instead of a short-term memory measure, right? So very, very classic. A lot of people kind of really do believe that this is the way that the system works, that there's a very clear division between short-term memory and working memory. Okay, I know that this looks really complicated. All I want to say here is that the division between short-term and working memory is actually not that straightforward. So there have been a lot of studies, mostly coming from Engel Lab, who, in terms of theoretical sort of conceptions of working memory, he's very much in the Nelson Cohen camp of things. He really thinks it's all about attention and focused attention. They call it executive attention. But one of the things that they have been doing is they've been doing these huge latent variable type studies where they measure a whole lot of things about short-term and working memory, and then they throw it into a factor analysis type situation, and they say, okay, how do these things cluster together? How do they load onto each other? And one of the things that they have been finding, and this is for the verbal memory in particular, is that if you throw in these classic working memory type tasks, like the operation span, the reading span, the counting span, right, that we think of as very classically working memory measures, And then you throw in tasks that we think of very much as short-term memory tasks, like the forward digit span or the word span, right? They do cluster onto their individual variables, but you can see that the relationship between working memory and short-term memory clusters is a 0.8. So there is actually a question here as to how separable working memory and short-term memory mechanisms are. The nice thing about it is that you can see that it's actually whatever you're measuring with your memory tasks is actually not the same as the measurements of intelligence, which I think we care about very much in the bilingualism literature and the language impairment literature, that whatever you're trying to measure is not a function of intellectual functioning. And it isn't. It's part of it, but it's not the same thing. Another way of thinking about it is actually, what they've done is they've actually contrasted a model that combines all of the tasks, working memory and short-term memory tasks together, versus a model that separates these two constructs out. And what they've shown is that the model that takes commonality across tasks as the basis actually fits the data much better than the model that thinks of short-term memory and working memory as two separable components. So the way to think about it is that there's a whole lot of common variance between your short-term memory tasks and your working memory tasks. And the cool thing is that it really seems to be a matter of task difficulty. So the short-term memory tasks start to look like working memory tasks when the task gets hard enough. So the way to think about it is that the digit span, your very basic, straightforward, I'm going to hear a string of numbers and spit them back out at you. If you give me a string that's 13 digits long, my performance on that task, cognitively speaking, is going to be indistinguishable from my performance on a backward digit span task. So to the Engel group, the difference between short-term memory and working memory tasks is not a categorical one. It's not that short-term memory tasks are just about storage and working memory tasks are about storage and attention. Storage and attention are always going to play a role. It's just that when the task is easy, you don't need to pay as much attention to it, right? And so it's not about categorical distinctions, it's about the difficulty levels. It's not about the secondary task, it's about the difficulty of the primary task. And that's what dictates whether you need to pay attention to it or not. And that's really all I wanted to say here unless anyone has questions.
How would the MBAC type tasks work into this world?
MBACs are interesting, right? So we actually, I'm going to show you some data for the MBACs. People debate as to what exactly an MBAC task actually measures.
MBAC is that you see a series of events, and for each one, if you're doing a two-back, you need to say, is what I'm seeing now the same as what I saw 2 steps ago?
Right.
Or
So,
1 step
yeah.
ago for an easier condition.
So
And you can do it verbally, you can do it spatially.
visually, spatially. So the idea is that you're constantly updating what's relevant, right? And in that sense, it becomes a working memory task. People who do working memory research don't think that it's actually a working memory task, right? People who do executive function research think that it's a working memory task. And it's a very interesting divide.
But how would it correlate with these types?
It doesn't. So performance on the NBAC, this is actually really interesting. So performance on the NBAC actually does not correlate with a whole lot of other working memory
So like
measures.
O-span and backward digit and stuff like that.
It doesn't, yeah. So, some people would argue is because NBAC primarily is an inhibitory control task as opposed to an updating task, which
I mean, but
should
they should
pose
correlate.
exactly. So it's NBAC is interesting, yeah.
Yet another thing we don't understand.
That's right. But I'm going to show you some NBAC data in just a second. So, okay. So this is where we are, right? So imagine kind of us coming into this with absolutely no understanding of how complicated the literature is and what it says. And we did a study where all we were interested in is whether bilinguals are better at learning new words than monolinguals. I'm actually going to show you these data first. And so, we went in, we recruited a group of bilingual adults and a group of monolingual adults. We made up this very easy word learning task. Here's a new word, here's its English translation, remember these two things. And a testing, please tell me what the English word is that goes with this new word that we taught you. And we said, we just need to make sure that our bilinguals and monolinguals don't differ on their, we at that time called it working memory, sort of not realizing that we weren't actually measuring that, supposedly. So we gave our people a digit span and a non-word repetition task, and we found that our bilinguals actually did better than the monolinguals on both the digit span and the non-word repetition task. And at the time, we didn't really think much of it. It's important to say that in this study, we were actually testing everyone in their native language. So our bilinguals were actually native English speakers with a whole lot of knowledge of Spanish, right? So at some point, what we did is we said, well, so does it mean that, there are no monolinguals? We have as high a digit span or a non-word repetition span as the bilinguals, and that's not true. So there are high span monolinguals who you can match very precisely to your bilinguals, and in this particular study, that's what we did. But the fact of the matter is that as a population, if you just randomly draw, and this is, right, college students, so if you randomly draw from the college student population, at least in the States, and at least from the Northwestern population, which these students were, you're much more likely to observe higher performance on these short-term memory measures in your bilinguals than in your monolinguals, right? And so at the time we thought, well, maybe the word learning advantage is just a function of higher short-term memory capacity, which may or may not be the case. But the fact of the matter is that the findings of positive effects of bilingualism on verbal memory are not very frequent. And in fact, what you're more likely to find are negative effects of bilingualism on verbal memory performance. So this is a case in point. This is a study that came out a few years ago where they did a word span and an alpha span. Both are kind of sort of working memory measures in the linguistic domain. They looked at young monolinguals and young bilinguals and older monolinguals and older bilinguals, and they actually showed that the bilinguals did less well on these tasks than the monolinguals. This is the nature of the language proficiency type thing. So these particular bilinguals were actually not necessarily native speakers of the language in which they were tested. But the fact that the medicine, for those of you who are interested in language impairment, for example, and the diagnosis of language impairment in bilingual kids, one of the arguments has been that, you cannot just go in and measure language in these children because you are measuring something that's sort of implicitly not going to look as good as that of a monolingual child. You cannot use monolingual norms. So maybe you should do tasks that require you to process information, right? And short-term memory tasks are actually a really attractive solution to the problem because it's less about what you know and it's more about what you can do with it, right? But if you know that literature, then you know that invariably bilingual children tested in their second language actually do less well than the monolingual children on tasks of verbal memory kind of across the board. And I'm going to show you some data to that effect as well. So this is actually a very common finding, that bilinguals do less well than monolinguals on verbal memory tasks. And then there's a whole lot of literature that says bilingualism does nothing for your working memory, right? And especially in the verbal domain. So this was a study, it's just an example, where they basically found absolutely no differences between bilinguals and monolinguals on a digit span task, none. And this was true for both the kids and the adolescents. And this is also very common. And in fact, in our lab, we find this all the time. Sometimes we get advantages, sometimes we don't. Sometimes we get disadvantages, sometimes we don't. It seems to vary a lot, largely, I think, because of language proficiency, but also because of task difficulty, which is something that I'm going to talk about a lot. So, there are all these conflicting data out there on the effect of bilingualism on verbal memory, and I think the reason for it, theoretically speaking, is actually pretty simple. And that's because verbal memory, right, and how you do on tasks like this, is very much an outcome of an interaction between your language knowledge and your attentional control. And it doesn't matter which theoretical camp you belong to, right? It really doesn't matter, because all approaches to working memory agree on this, that in the verbal domain, it's really about what you know about the language and how much you can pay attention to it in the service of a particular task that you're trying to do. So in Dadley's conceptualization, the function of the phonological loop is constrained by your language knowledge and the central executive. In the Cohen-Engel approach to things, it's very much an interaction between your focused attentional capacity and the activation of relevant knowledge in the long-term memory system, right? And so in the bilingualism literature, it makes sense why you're getting all these crazy inconsistent findings. And it's because, you know, there are actually quite a lot of data suggesting that when it comes to language-specific acquisition, bilinguals don't do as well as monolinguals, right? So if you take both languages into account and you look at the knowledge of concepts, it's very even. But if you just look at language-specific knowledge, which is what this is actually, right? This is language-specific knowledge. This is not conceptual stuff. This is your knowledge of lexical forms. This is your knowledge of, right, language-specific information. You know, there are these very classic findings from the 70s showing that bilingual kids don't do as well as the monolingual kids on measures of verbal IQ, they called it. This is actually just vocabulary. There are very large-scale studies that demonstrate exactly the same thing, these lags in language-specific vocabulary that persist into adolescence. And in the adult literature, right, there's now sort of a semi-famous study. This was a picture naming study done with adults, bilinguals and monolinguals. And the interesting thing about it is that these are data for bilinguals naming pictures in your native language. And they're actually slower to do it than their monolingual counterparts. So there's something about language-specific lexical access that bilingualism makes more difficult. And mechanisms-wise, we're not sure what exactly is going on, right? There's the frequency explanation, there's the exposure explanation, there's the competition explanation, but whatever it is, the combination of things, the fact of the matter is that even in the native language, right, bilinguals may not be actually processing information as efficiently as monolinguals. So, you know, that long-term knowledge, right, that very much matters for verbal memory function is not the same for your bilinguals and monolinguals, right? So that's one factor. And this is the proficiency issue. But the other factor is the central executive, attentional control, focused attention, whatever you want to call it. And you don't necessarily have to believe and embrace wholeheartedly data that suggests that bilinguals are so much better at inhibitory control than monolinguals. I'm sure you know this literature. But there's actually some evidence for it that, you know, on tasks like a task shifting measure, which is what this is a Wisconsin card sort, right? Which I didn't realize was actually created in Wisconsin until I got there. But bilingual kids actually do this better than the monolingual kids. So they learn to shift dimensions earlier than the monolingual children. And there's a bunch of nonverbal, inhibitory control, focused attention type tasks on which bilinguals, not consistently and not across the board, and this is not true for all the bilinguals, but there's actually a critical mass of literature at this point that suggests that maybe there's something to it, that bilingualism actually facilitates cognitive control. So on tasks that require you to suppress something in your environment and to really focus your attention on something else, right? Bilinguals sometimes do better than monolinguals. And again, for whatever purpose and reason. So, you know, you get this with the flanker task, you get it with the silent task, you get it with the local global task. This is my favorite task. This is the ambiguous figure reversal task. I don't know if you can see it, but, you know, there's actually two images, right, embedded in it, right? And your ability to shift between them actually is a measure of inhibitory control, right? So you suppress the bunny, you activate the duck, right? Bilingual kids actually do this better than the monolingual kids, which is kind of neat. So, you know, if you go back to this idea that verbal memory is really an interaction between language knowledge and focused attention, right? And then you think about what bilingualism will do for working memory, right? You can see why you get these hugely discrepant findings across the board, because sometimes bilingualism will have a negative effect on long-term knowledge, right? Sometimes bilingualism will have a positive effect on executive control, focused attention, centralized attentional, whatever, resources. And so when you do studies examining working memory in bilinguals, these are things that you need to think about and worry about, right? It's not just about verbal memory, it's about these other cognitive systems that very much constrain what you can do on a verbal memory task. So the way that we have been approaching our working memory work is by kind of thinking about these two domains and their role in constraining verbal memory performance in bilinguals. So does that make sense? Is this helpful at all? Okay. So this is kind of the theoretical part of things. And then I'm just going to throw a whole lot of data at you, just to kind of show you where we are data-wise and what we think it all means.
Can I ask something about so if we take the distinction between the short-term memory tasks and the working memory tasks, then supposedly the difference would be executive function, central executive, task difficulty, all these things, and not so much the long-term memory, or are we assuming some sort of interaction so that it would not be additive?
So the way we're thinking about it is that if you make the task more difficult, you shift the burden away from long-term knowledge to executive function. And I'm going to show you that in just a second. So that's the way we've been thinking about it. And you can also make your tasks more or less language dependent, and that's the other way of thinking about it. So the first experiment I'm going to show you, that's exactly where we kind of were going. So we said, okay, we're going to manipulate the difficulty level of the task, right? Kind of going off of this angle approach to working memory. The idea being is that if we make the task really hard, even in a verbal domain, right, it's no longer going to be about language knowledge so much as the ability to pay attention to it, right? And then we're going to actually manipulate the structure of the task to be more or less language dependent, right? So you guys with me? So this is what we sort of did. So we said, okay, task difficulty, right, is a way to manipulate attention. Task type is a way to manipulate long-term memory. So this is a study that G1 did. This was a while back, actually. So she did it with Korean English bilinguals. These are adults. So they're native Korean speakers acquiring English as a second language in the university setting. So this is at Wisconsin. And we had about 25, 30 of these guys. And so, you know, we tried to match them as well as we could on age and years of education, but it wasn't super successful. And it's just because the population of students who come from Korea to study in the United States, these are very special students. So one of the things that I'm going to keep saying is that, you know, we actually need to try and replicate this in other language groups, because I'm not sure that the data I'm going to show you in just a second will look exactly this way for different kinds of L2 learners. But this is what we have at this point. So,
But why do you, sorry to interrupt, why do you call them bilinguals?
because their English is actually quite good.
Okay, so your measurement is based on proficiency?
Yes. Yeah, so we basically, so you can see this, well, maybe you cannot see this here. So we actually were after a group of bilinguals. So I'm going to call bilinguals everyone who has any kind of knowledge of two languages, right? So just kind of putting it out there. But in reality, these are L2 speakers, very much so. So these are, you know, native Korean speakers. They have had a few years of English exposure. You can see that they're rating themselves. So this is a scale from 0 to 10, with 0 being I don't know English at all, and 10 is I'm a native speaker of English. They are situated somewhere between 5 and 8. So, you know, they're not non-proficient, they're not native-like. And then we actually gave them standardized measures of English vocabulary knowledge, and you can see that they're actually performing within the mean, within the norm, right? So they are at 87, right, standard scores wise. They're at 87 on the PPVT, which is the receptive measure of English vocabulary, and they're at 97 for the EVT, the expressive measure, right? This is very normal, right? 100 is the mean. But you can see that the monolinguals are doing way better because they're college students. They should be doing better than the mean. And so what we're doing here is we're saying, okay, we have a bilingual population that in terms of their broad knowledge of English, right, is doing less well than the native speakers we're going to compare them to, right? So if verbal memory performance is just an outcome of how much you know the language, right? When you have these populations, your prediction should be that on all the linguistic memory measures, your bilinguals should do less well than the monolinguals, right? That's kind of where we start out. So the tasks, what we did, I mean, we did a whole bunch of stuff, but these are the tasks that I'm going to show you. So we did the non-word repetition task, which to us, and the way that we actually use the task, this is as low of a language demand as we could possibly create while still calling it a verbal memory task. So these are non-words. They don't exist in English, they don't exist in Korean. And the cool thing about them is that the database that we took them from, this is the Gupta 2004 database if anyone is interested. The nice thing about these made-up words is that phonotactically, right, they actually are English-like. So all the sounds are English, all the transitional kind of probabilities are English, but prosodically, they actually are kind of funky. So they don't necessarily activate a whole lot of English language knowledge, right? So structurally speaking, they're English-like, right? Then if you think of language demands on a continuum, we think of the non-word repetition task as the least languagey kind of a task. We think of the word span task as the most languagey type task because you're hearing English words and you need to repeat them in the same order as you heard them, right? And then we think of digit span as somewhere in the middle, right? Because digits are still words, right? And some would argue this is part of your automatic language repertoire, right? They're like encoded in your sort of, you know, the most basic of the basic language substrates. But they're not really semantically very rich, right? So they're not like real words. There isn't a whole lot of meaning that goes with them. And there's only 10 of them, right? So in terms of languagey characteristics, they sort of sit in the middle, right? And what we also did is we manipulated the task difficulty level of each of our tasks. So for the non-word repetition task, we had a simple non-word repetition where you just hear a made-up word and then you need to say it back, right? And then we created 2 dual tasks, right? Where we basically tried to go very classic battle-y to try and get at sort of short-term memory versus working memory. So we embedded a secondary task that was also linguistic in nature. So it's still a non-word repetition task. But now, instead of just hearing a made-up word and then saying it back, what you do is you do an intermediate animacy judgment, right? Between when you hear a word and when you need to say it back. Basically what happened is you heard a noun and you had to decide whether it's a living thing or a dead thing or a non-living thing, right? It's not dead. So. Right? Table versus dog, right? That kind of a thing.
So it's a different word that we hear.
Yes.
It's not.
No. So you hear a non-word, then you hear a real English word. You decide whether it's living or non-living, and then you repeat the non-word back, right? And we kept the timing exactly the same, right? So the cue to repeat the word, the non-word, occurred at exactly the same time across all of these conditions. It's just that here you had to do some sort of a cognitive task in between. And then we also did a cross-modal task where the secondary task wasn't an animacy judgment, it was a visual search type task where you saw a visual array and you had to decide whether there was an L shape within all of that mess of little things, right? So in sort of classic conceptualization, this is short-term memory, and these two are working memory tasks. And if you believe in modality-specific, right, working memory function, you expect more interference in the animacy condition than the visual search condition, right? You guys with me? Okay. So these two are more difficult. That one is easier. So these are the data, right? So there's actually really, I mean, on the one hand, nothing interesting, and on the other hand, a whole lot of interesting. So monolinguals are in dark, and the bilinguals are in light. And if you're looking at this go and you didn't find anything, it's because that's exactly what happened. So, so the top one is the simple task, and then we have the unimodal one, and then we have the cross-modal one. I mean, certain things work, and it's nice to know that they work across languages and across populations. So longer non-words are more difficult to repeat than shorter non-words. This is true for everyone, right? Unimodal tasks, where you just repeat non-words without having to do anything else, are easier than the dual tasks. And this is true for both bilinguals and monolinguals, right? The within modality secondary task interferes more than the cross-modal secondary task. So everyone is doing worse with the animacy judgment than with the visual search. This is true for both bilinguals and monolinguals. But there are no group differences, none. So your bilinguals and monolinguals are actually doing exactly the same thing across the board on all of these measures and all of these tasks. This is actually something that we haven't been able to replicate with other populations.
Are these your Korean English?
Yep. And so they're doing this with English non-words, right? And we think part of the problem is the non-words that we're using here are actually very, I mean, they're English-like, but they're not as English-like as the non-words have been in other studies, right? So this is a very low load on the long-term language system. And so even less proficient bilinguals are not having all that much difficulty with the non-word repetition task.
Were there any clearly non-Korean features of the English non-words?
Yeah. Yeah. The Korean has sounds that English does not, and none of these non-words include those.
I'm asking the other way around.
Oh, the other way around.
Could they have been Korean non-words?
Oh, no. We actually, so that's actually interesting. We actually have data for the Korean non-word repetition test, which I'll show you in just a second, for a different group of participants. And I'll show you what that looks like, and yeah, correlations with the English ones. So keep this, yeah.
Can you say something about the unimodal task, about the duration of the task? I mean, how long did you, how long was the
Yeah, so
interference?
they had 4 seconds between the presentation of the non-word and when they had to retrieve it. And that 4-second interval was maintained across all the permutations of the task, right?
Yeah, why did you choose 4 seconds?
Because that's how long it would take to hear a noun in between and make a decision on it without stressing people out too much. So we piloted it. And also because the decay in the short-term memory system, right, is anywhere from 3 to 7 seconds, depending on who you ask. And so 4 seconds seemed like a good compromise. Making it faster didn't give people enough time to do the secondary task.
No, I was thinking of long, but I
if
wasn't
you-
aware of this.
If you make it longer, then what ends up happening is that you give people time to rehearse. And once you give people time to rehearse, it's no longer a short-term memory task.
Yeah, but if you interrupt them during it's still.
Well, that's exactly what you're doing, right? So you're basically preventing their ability to do anything
Yeah.
by dual tasking the system,
Yeah,
right?
but if the dual tasking is longer, what will happen?
So delay is actually a very interesting thing to manipulate on the short-term memory task. So the idea is that if you give people more time between when they hear something and when they need to repeat it back, you're giving them opportunities to rehearse, right? And what you actually will end up with is some sort of a primacy effect, which I'll actually show you in just a second. We've actually tried to get at that. So we've never manipulated delay as a factor of its own. We always control it and manipulate other things because it's actually unclear how delay maps onto short-term versus working memory, right? So if you're kind of going for a very straightforward contrast between the two, manipulating delay is actually something that you don't want to do, right? Yeah.
I have another methodological question. So, for these dual tasks, how do you want them to be accurate on the intervening tasks, right? So, do you set a criteria for where I'm just wondering how you deal with the performance of the intervening tasks.
We measure it. And then we say, do bilinguals and monolinguals differ in how they do on the intervening task? And luckily for us, in this particular study, they didn't. So they actually did similarly well on the visual search, and they did similarly well on the animacy judgment, which is interesting considering that bilinguals are doing the animacy judgment in their L2. But these are, we picked as simple a set of vocabulary items as we possibly could. So, these are high frequency, early acquired, super concrete things.
But does that mean that the performance across the different conditions is also the same?
No. So the performance on the secondary tasks actually fluctuates as a function of the difficulty level of the primary task. So people do less well on the animacy judgment task when they need to repeat the 6-syllable non-words than when they need to repeat the 2-syllable non-words. But it's the group differences that really matter, right? And in that sense, the groups didn't differ on the secondary task.
So you just measure it, record it, but you don't take it into account when you calculate the primary task?
No. And I'm not sure how you would, actually.
Well, one option is to set some criteria, right? You can say if they're above 85% accurate on the secondary task, then we'll include them. Otherwise, perhaps they weren't paying attention or really doing the primary task.
So you can, you should definitely screen the data out, because you can imagine that a very effective strategy would be to just ignore the secondary task altogether and be completely random, right? That didn't happen. Which is, people were actually doing the tasks. Yeah.
Did you measure or so what you show us here is accuracy performance? To look at the type of errors that the two would do?
We didn't. We basically just defined. So this was scored phoneme by phoneme, and so which is actually an interesting exercise to do. Right, scoring accuracy of non-word pronunciation in non-native speakers of a language. That was kind of fun. So the way we ended up doing it, so you want to give people credit for producing the phoneme correctly, and you need to make sure that you can easily separate out an incorrect phoneme versus a correct phoneme produced with an accent, right? And how you do it with non-words is sort of fascinating. So we just ended up training our coders, and we had just a whole lot of reliability kind of procedures in place to make that work.
And correct was only 100% correct?
Yeah, so it was actually proportion correct. So for each non-word, you basically said, say a non-word consists of 12 phonemes, and of the 12, they produced 8 correctly. And it was position-based. So to get a point correct, you had to produce the correct phoneme in the correct position in the non-word. Yeah. But this, we've never done non-word repetition again. Partially, no, because it's actually really difficult to score and to decide what's correct and what's incorrect, and to do it with non-native speakers. And what do you do with prosodic fluctuations, right? And errors is something that's really interesting to think about, but we just kind of quit. I think this was our only non-word repetition study. So these are the digit span data. So we had a forward digit span and a backward digit span, right? And we transformed these to z-scores because they weren't on the same scale. So, in order to show them side by side, we did something to the data. So this is what the data ended up looking like. So monolinguals are dark and the bilinguals are gray. Now remember, they're doing this in their L2, right? The bilinguals are. So on the forward digit span, you see bilinguals not doing as well as the monolinguals, which is what you would predict, right? They're doing this in their less proficient language, digits are not as automatic, right? This is, people have shown it over and over again. On a backward digit span, something curious is happening, right? Because the differences are statistically not significant at this point, and they actually reverse in direction, right? You see that? So bilinguals are actually doing just a little better than the monolinguals. Where it gets really cool is on the word span data. So it's a very simple task. You hear a series of words, and then you just need to repeat them out loud. And we manipulated the difficulty level of the task by increasing the number of words in the list, right? So we had easy word lists, just 5 words to remember, everyone can do it. And then it scaled up, 10 words, 15 words, 20 words. So these are easy
The
lists.
order of the words were important?
The order of the words was important. They had to recall them in the order that they heard them, right? So this is 5 word lists, right? You hear 5 words and you need to repeat them, right? Monolinguals are doing better than the bilinguals. What you would expect, they're doing it in their native language, the monolinguals are, bilinguals are doing it in their L2. We have clear proficiency differences between the 2 groups. This is what you would predict. This is what happens when you up the difficulty level, right? So on 10 word lists, the differences between groups actually disappear. On 15 and 20 group lists, the differences reverse and actually become significant. When we found this, I still don't quite buy it. Like, I think there's something about these particular bilinguals. But the fact of the matter is that that's what the data show. And it's I mean, we've looked at it every which way, and this is it. This is the finding. So when you make the task really hard, bilinguals do better than the monolinguals in their L2, which is kind of crazy. So, you know, we had these data and we were like, oh, this is nice. And, you know, we said, oh, look, you know, language knowledge matters, right? When you have tasks like the non-word repetition, which don't load very much on language, you don't get differences between groups. Once language is involved, task difficulty matters, right? So on easier levels of the task, it's your knowledge of the language that constrains performance. If you have proficiency differences going in, monolinguals will do better than bilinguals because it's all about your language system and what it can support, right? Once the task gets really hard, it's no longer about your language knowledge, it maybe is about your executive attention, and there, bilinguals may actually be better than monolinguals, and so even in the second language, that ability to pay focused attention to a task at hand takes over and supersedes long-term knowledge in constraining verbal memory performance. I will tell you that at this point, we need to replicate this. I mean, we really do. We haven't been able to yet.
So you've tried and it didn't work the same way?
Well,
or?
we tried it in kids, which I will show you in just a second, because we thought, well, you know, everything. So the nice thing is that, you know, the bilingualism stuff actually works better in kids than adults, because when the system is in flux, you're more likely to push it, right? And so the effects of bilingualism across the board on everything are actually more easily found in children than in young adults who are at their peak on everything, and so everything works very nicely. So we went and looked for it in kids, and it like totally bombed, and I'll show you in just a second why it bombed. So, you know, we had these data, and then we kept trying to get at long-term knowledge and the role that it plays in constraining verbal memory performance. I'm just going to show you a few more experiments that we did with this particular population. So one thing that we thought here that maybe wasn't quite right is that we're going across groups, right? And we're comparing bilinguals to monolinguals. We think that we're kind of capturing proficiency, but because we're doing it across subjects, there could be other stuff playing a role, and that's why we see the differences that we see or we don't see the differences that we don't see. So we thought we should go in and look within the bilingual, right? So instead of going bilinguals, monolinguals, we're gonna look at L1 versus L2, right? Because that's within subjects. So you're keeping cognition constant and you're just manipulating language level knowledge, right? So this was again done with Korean English bilinguals. And so we took the non-word repetition task and we just did one iteration of it. So we did the non-word repetition with the lexical decision because we thought that one worked really nicely in terms of creating high competition for resources, right? Performance on the lexical decision. Non-word repetition task was way worse than on a simple non-word repetition task. So we thought that might be a nice way to create the difficulty continuum. And we actually ended up having to design non-words in Korean, which was kind of fun. I wish I could play you a few examples of this. You know, people always talk about non-word repetition being non-language dependent and it being less language dependent than other tasks. But the fact of the matter is, some non-words are much more word-like than others. And so when I hear Korean non-words versus English non-words, to me, it's like hearing, you know, English versus Mandarin Chinese. I mean, the difference is striking, just in terms of how well you can repeat these things. So these were the participants. So they're much more proficient in Korean than they are in English. It's very, very clear. They're native speakers of Korean. That's the language that they have used from birth until the time when they came to the United States to study. And so you can see these are very Korean dominant college students. Their English is okay. They're exposed to English, but not as much as they are exposed to Korean, even currently. There's a very tight Korean community in Madison. One of the things that we've realized is that all the Korean speakers in Madison actually know each other. And so
That should help with recruiting participants?
yes and no, because you keep testing the same people over and over again. But this was the population. I think we had about 30 of them in this particular study. And so we did this. So one question was whether the short-term versus working memory type demands would function differently in the native language versus the second language. And they actually don't. They function very, very similarly. So the short-term memory tasks are easier than the working memory tasks. This is true whether you do these tasks in your native language or your second language. And it's also true across difficulty levels, right? So for easier non-words, just 2 syllables long, versus more difficult non-words, 6 syllables long, these distinctions between short-term and working memory, they hold. So that's nice, right? The second question had to do with L1 versus L2, right? So across all the difficulty levels and across the short-term versus working memory tasks, what will L1 versus L2 look like? And this was kind of unexpected. So what happened was, at the easiest level of the task, right? So this is a short-term memory task, 2 syllable non-words, very easy to do. L1, L2 doesn't matter because you're actually sealing out. You do so well in both conditions that there are no group differences. Once the difficulty level goes up, group differences, not group differences, language differences start to emerge, right? So the task gets more difficult within the short-term memory kind of a setup. Longer words basically engender L1, L2 differences, right? And you can see this. So L1 is the dark, L2 is the white, and on all the conditions except for the 2 syllable non-words at the very beginning, people do much better in the native language than in the second language, right? So yes, these non-word repetition type tasks are less language dependent perhaps, and knowledge dependent than other tasks like the word span, but clearly knowledge matters, right? You're going to do this better in your more proficient language than your less proficient language, and knowledge matters more as the task gets more difficult, which is not quite the same conclusion that we drew when we contrasted bilinguals and monolinguals, right? There we said the task gets more difficult, the demand for long-term knowledge goes down, the demand for focused attention goes up. But here we see that within the individual, as the task gets more difficult, knowledge becomes more important.
Well, it could be, so if you look at it from like an automaticity perspective, if L1 is automatic, you need less resources to deal with whatever language
That's right.
it is you're doing. And so that's why it plays out that way.
Yeah, but you
So-
could also argue the other way around, right? So that's the thing, it's sort of, so one of the difficulties with doing this work is that your findings will very much depend on your task and your participants, and you're gonna get fluctuation. I mean, we were sampling from exactly the same population.
So if you compare these guys in L1 to the monolinguals from the previous study in English, are they doing better?
Yeah, they are. And, what that could be due to is unclear, because it could be a stimulus design problem, or it could be a population problem.
Or it could actually be about.
Or it
working
could
with-
actually be about bilinguals doing better, so that's also a possibility. So one thing that we did was we actually said, okay, so let's actually look at the relationship between L1 and L2 performance across all these different permutations of the task, with the idea being that, and we weren't quite sure what we're gonna get, but the idea was L1, L2 linkages should be stronger, right, for tasks that are less language specific perhaps, right? So the idea was if you up the difficulty level of the task, you increase the need for control attention, and so in that sense, performance should be less a function of language specific knowledge. And that's kind of what we found. So looking at the working memory data, which is this column, these are actually all significant in terms of correlations. So we're comparing L1 performance on the X, not comparing, we're linking L1 performance to L2 performance on the Y, right, across difficulty levels. And you can see that in the working memory data, from the easier, so 2-syllable words, to 4-syllable to 6-syllable words, L1 and L2 performance are actually very much linked, right? So people who do better on Korean non-word repetition also do better on the English non-word repetition, right? If you look at the short-term memory data, at the 2 easier levels of the task, so 2-syllable non-words and 4-syllable words, those are actually not significant correlations. So L1 and L2 actually don't go together. But when we get to 6-syllable non-words, that's when the correlation becomes significant. And so if you think back to Engel's idea of it's really not about dual tasking versus single tasking, it's about how hard is the actual task that you're trying to do. Once the non-word got so long that you had to start paying active attention to it, it starts behaving like a working memory measure, right? So this was kind of nice. Do you guys have questions about this?
Can you explain again the difference between these correlations and the? I guess I'm confused about the previous figure.
This is just group differences.
Right, but this, I guess, is there an interaction here?
There isn't, yes, there is an
Okay.
interaction, yeah.
So
There
as
isn't-
task difficulty goes up, the
Group
difference-
differences
okay.
become
That
larger.
part I was missing. Okay.
But it's interesting, right? So group differences become larger, but they link to each other tighter. Right?
Well, it's not group differences, it's language.
It's language differences, yeah. So again, like I said, we're still thinking about this. We don't actually quite know what to do with this. It may be a function of Korean versus English, because the languages are very different. And the extent of cross-linguistic similarity and the role that it plays in some of these findings, I think, has not been examined nearly thoroughly enough. So one of the things that we're going to try and do is do it with Spanish and English, because the languages, phonologically speaking, are much closer together. So the question is, will L1, L2 cross links work the same way in speakers of languages where the languages are actually a bit more convergent. Because you can imagine that, you know, part of this may just simply be a transfer thing or a lack of transfer, right? So you wouldn't be able to map much of English onto a Korean phonological system, and so, you know, no one talks about language-specific phonological loops, but maybe we should, right? So, you know, we think there's something about focused attention here that's playing a role, that it's not about language-specific knowledge, it's about your broad ability to pay attention in service of a verbal task, any verbal task, right?
Can you just remind us what were the working memory?
It's the non-word repetition task with the animacy judgment.
And the SDM is the same word?
Short-term memory, just non-word repetition with no interference.
And it's the same normal.
Same timing, it was exactly the same paradigm, except
And
we
the same
took
stimuli?
the same English stimuli and then the Korean stimuli that were designed to work the same way. Yeah.
I'm wondering how much this is about the range in terms of the L2 proficiency.
Yeah.
Right? So you get less correlation in part because they're not tapping the L2 language system that much.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. I mean, that's the argument.
Okay.
So, basically, you know, we think that it's sort of what we're seeing is kind of two things, right? Native language knowledge becomes much more important as the task gets more difficult, but focused attention also becomes much more important as the task becomes more difficult. And so we were still kind of unsure what to do with the data in terms of how much of it we could attribute to long-term knowledge and how much of it we could attribute to something else, right? And we kind of started thinking about maybe looking at the data in a different way and kind of getting at it from more of an item-based perspective as opposed to a subject-based perspective. And so one of the very famous things about recall is that when you get a list of things to remember, a human memory doesn't do it randomly and it doesn't do it evenly. So there are very strong order effects in terms of what you can recall when. And these order effects actually have been used to think about the structure and the function of the working memory system. So what I'm talking here about are the primacy and recency effects. So I don't know how familiar you are with this, but there is a way to actually examine, right, whether people remember information better that occurred at the beginning of the list versus the middle of the list versus the end of the list. So what you usually use for these kinds of measures is a free recall task, right? So unlike the word span task where you need to remember the words in the order that you heard them, on a free recall task you get to remember the words in any order, right? And then the question becomes then, which words do you remember and why, right? So, so you basically listen to a list of words and then you know, do this, and then you have to recall the words as many of them as you can in any order that you can remember them in. And of interest here is, what are these words that you're remembering? Where in the list did they actually occur? And the reason why we got really interested in this is because there are actually serial position curve effects in the free recall data. Now, I will kind of just step out of this for a second and tell you that not everyone actually agrees on this. And not everyone agrees on how you interpret primacy and recency effects in free recall tasks. But the classic, very classic interpretation is that the primacy effects in the data, meaning you are better at recalling words at the beginning of the list than the middle of the list. The idea is that this is about your long-term memory. the reason why it's about your long-term memory is because the stuff that happened at the beginning, you actually had time to rehearse, right? And so it had time to seep into your long-term memory, and so when you're retrieving things, that's where you're retrieving them from. It's from the long-term memory system. Recency effects basically show up when you're better at recalling the last items that you've heard versus the middle items. And the idea here is that the recency effects are actually a function of the short-term memory proper, because that's the most recent stuff. It's still in your short-term memory. When you're recalling, it hasn't had time to go away, right? And so for us, this is neat, because we can basically say, okay, if primacy effects in the data are a function of the long-term knowledge, right, then maybe there's something about L1, L2, monolingual, bilingual, that we can get to if we look at the primacy effects of the data. If the recency effects of the data are a function of short-term memory, right, then maybe the recency effects are going to be less susceptible, right, less influenced by proficiency stuff, right? So maybe that's the way to get at it. So we did a study. Now we're still trying to kind of publish this. So this is kind of new data, new thinking, and again Korean, just because that's the population. So we created a free recall task, and we did it in both Korean and in English. And we tried to control for everything that we could, but then, when you do cross-linguistic work, I will not kind of say that, yes, we actually did control for everything. So we manipulated a whole bunch of stuff, because we were gonna, we're starting this work, so we threw everything we could in the mix. So we manipulated syllable length of the words themselves. So we had words that were very short, 1 syllable. We had words that were a little longer, 2-syllable, words that were really long, 3-syllable words. And we also manipulated how many of the words were in the lists. So we had 10-word lists, 15-word lists, and 20-word lists. So we're kind of playing with difficulty levels here in various ways. And so this is a free recall task. It's actually a really hard task, especially if you look at this. This is 3-syllable words, right? It's actually really hard to do. And these are presented auditorily, so people listen to them. And, you hear a list of words. We randomize the order for everyone. And then you just have to remember them. And you have to recall as many of them as you possibly can. So we had 19 monolinguals, 19 bilinguals. And this is a pretty common sort of situation. We tried to match them for age and years of education. But you can see that English-wise, these guys are not doing as well as their monolingual native speaker counterparts. They're doing really well. They're not low by any means. They're just not as good as the monolinguals. And nonverbal IQ always gives us trouble, especially with this group of students, because these are very bright kids. Yeah. So, yeah, because to come to the States from Korea, you need to be very, very bright. So we every once in a while get IQ discrepancies between bilinguals and monolinguals, but in this case, the difference is actually not significant. So anyway, the way that we coded these data, and again, people vary in terms of how they code for primacy and recency effects. This is one way to do it. You basically define the regions depending on how long your list is. So for 10-word lists, we said that the first 3 words for us will be the recency region, the last 3 words will be the primacy region, and the 4 words in the middle will be the middle region. We kind of did it the same way, fluctuating the number of words in each region. So the way that we coded this was kind of like this. So if the person heard these words, right, in this particular order, and then recalled these particular words, what you basically do is you say, so you do it this way, right? And then you say, okay, in the primacy region, they got 2 out of 3 correct, so it's a 0.67 accuracy rate. in the middle region, they got nothing right, so that's a 0, and in the primacy region, they got everything right, so that's 100%, right? And this is your basic U-shaped serial position curve, right? Everyone knows this. So the question is, what's going to happen in L1 versus L2, and what's going to happen in monolinguals versus bilinguals, right? And so it's just kind of the same way. Okay, so these are bilinguals, and I'm showing you data in Korean versus English, right? Korean native language, English second language. The first thing is, which is always nice to see, is that yes, you do get a U-shaped curve, right? So you get your primacy effects, you get your recency effects, and it's true whether you do it in L1 or L2. So that's great. This is where it gets really nice. You actually get stronger pre-recency effects, meaning that you get stronger primacy effects and stronger middle phase effects in L1 than you do in L2, right? So so if you think about these effects as being a function of long-term knowledge, right, you can look at it and say, nice, right? So at the level of the task where it's all about what you can encode in your long-term memory, native language really is important. You're more proficient in it, it matters more, right? Where it gets really cool is if you get a little more detailed about this and you say, okay, how does this work across the difficulty levels of the task? So that's where it gets a little more complicated, right?
So the previous graph was averaging.
Averaging across everything, yeah. But there was actually an interaction with the difficulty level, so I'm going to show you this just because I don't know what to make of it, so I figure I'll just share. So at the easiest level of the task, right, so 10 word lists, you get really nice, strong pre-recency effects in the L1, right, versus the L2. But do you guys see what happens in the recency region, right? This is your short-term memory, supposedly. And all of a sudden, you get stronger recency effects in the second language than the native language. But when you get to the most difficult level of the task, right here, right, all of a sudden in that region, it's the L1 again, right? So there's something interesting that's going on here where, in general, right, long-term knowledge of the language matters more for the earlier items in the list, unless the task is really, really hard, at which point your language proficiency is going to come up again.
But isn't it what you just said before?
Yeah, it does. So it
That's
converges. Converges, but that's why I think we should actually try and do this with another population. Because internally, for these bilinguals, yeah, it all meshes together. But
it does contradict what you found for the monolingual versus bilingual.
So let me show you the monolingual data. So this is just, okay. So now we actually do have monolingual data here. So this is the overall data pattern. Now remember, monolinguals are doing it in English and bilinguals are doing it in English. And so what you see here is in the primacy in the middle region, no differences between groups. And in the recency region, bilinguals are actually doing better than the monolinguals. Which, you know, if you then go by difficulty level, that effect only holds for the easier levels of the task, right? So there's something, I actually really like these data. I like thinking about these tasks in item-based ways, instead of just broad group differences and broad L1, L2 differences. I think it's actually kind of productive. And so I will say that, you know, we get stronger recency effects in the native language than the second language, which makes a lot of sense if you think of recency data as reflecting long-term knowledge, right? And then you get better recency effects in bilinguals than in monolinguals who are doing it in their L2, right? Which is weird unless you think of the recency effects as reflecting maybe processes that are less language dependent, and then you have to say maybe it's all about attention again. right? So these are the adult data. Questions? Should we take a break or should I show you our kid data?
Let's take a break and
Let's
then
take
go
a
on.
break, yeah, sounds good.
So let's get back around 11, around the clock.
I might actually go to 12.
הבנתי שאני לא מבינה.
מה קרה?
למה לא יהיה? הצבא שלי.
האיזון.
אני בגלל זה עברתי ישראל. לא מסכים. זה נכון.
Alright, so I'm gonna actually try and do this in an hour. We'll see how it goes.
יש לי את השם
Dual test. Cross-language dual testing. That's been happening a lot. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the childhood data, which Anna tells me people are very interested in. And I wasn't actually going to talk about it in relation to diagnosis, but I will. So, you know, we started doing this work actually initially as a way to test for the possibility of using these working memory tasks for diagnostic purposes. And the reason for it is because there's actually a clear precedent for it in the SLI literature, right? So the idea is that bilingual children with specific language impairment are actually really hard to diagnose because second language issues and SLI issues look very, very similar. So if you just go in and you compare typically developing bilingual kids in stages of second language acquisition to monolingual children, in terms of raw numbers on standardized measures of language, grammar, whatever, vocabulary, they look indistinguishable from monolingual children with SLI. And so what do you do when you have a bilingual child who is scoring so low on tests of vocabulary measures? How do you decide if you're looking at just low English proficiency or if you're actually looking at language impairment? And so one of the suggestions, a very powerful suggestion in the literature has been, well, don't look at vocabulary knowledge. It's going to be a given that your bilinguals are going to do less well on it than your monolinguals. Look at processing-based tasks, right? This is the terminology used in language impairment literature. So look at tasks that require you to process information versus the tasks that require you to access some sort of stored knowledge about this information. And the reason why working memory tasks are so attractive is because there's actually a huge literature documenting working memory deficits in kids with language impairment, right? So kids with SLI do less well than typically developing children on non-word repetition tasks. They do less well on listening span tasks. They do less well on all kinds of permutations of verbal, and some would argue visual working memory tasks. And so the idea is that a task like non-word repetition is much less dependent on your vocabulary and grammar knowledge than a task like grammaticality judgment, for example, or tense generation, right, or picture verification type task. And so bilingual kids who are typically developing, tested in their second language, should do as well on non-word repetition tasks as the monolingual counterparts. And if they do less well, then you're looking at language impairment, right? So that's kind of the logic there. The problem is that when people do this kind of work, they don't necessarily embed it in theoretical models of working memory, and they don't think about long-term knowledge playing a role. And they don't think of attentional control as playing a role. And so when we started doing this work, we wanted to actually approach it in the way that we've been approaching the adult work. From a very theoretical standpoint, thinking about difficulty level, thinking about long-term knowledge of language, and what these interactions would look like in typically developing bilingual children, with the goal of maybe potentially zeroing in on some of the working memory tasks that could be useful for diagnostic purposes, right? So the data I'm going to show you are actually from 3 groups of bilingual kids. And this was our way of maybe manipulating language proficiency in English. So we had a huge group of monolingual children. These kids are between the ages of 5 and 7, which is about how old you need to be in order to do some of the tasks that I'm going to show you. So in terms of when working memory develops, people argue about it. Most people would say about 3 is when the system starts to actually come online, in the sense that children will start to actively rehearse information, right, in order to encode it. But verbal rehearsal really will come in sometime between 4 and 5, and some of the working memory tasks, like listening span tasks that I'll show you in just a second, you couldn't do with a child who is younger than 5, period. They just will not understand what you want from them. And so there are age considerations in place over and above theoretical considerations. So the monolingual children are typically developing, in fact all of our kids are typically developing. Documenting typical development in bilingual kids is actually kind of an interesting exercise. You sort of go by what the parent tells you and the availability of a formal diagnosis, and then your own clinical judgment. Because standardized measures that verify diagnostic status in L2 are basically not worth it. And then we had 2 groups of bilingual children. We're now kind of shifting ages, right, from the adult work, but we're also shifting languages. So it just so happens that Spanish is the most widely spoken language in the United States, and in terms of children in Madison, that's the population that's the most prevalent. So we went with Spanish-speaking kids just because that was the population available to us. But of course that means that there is now language inconsistency across the adult work and the pediatric work. So we had a group of simultaneous bilingual children, which we defined as acquisition of both English and Spanish prior to age 3. Which we can actually argue whether that's the right way of thinking about it, but it's a very traditional way of doing it, at least. So these kids grew up with both languages in the home, and you can see that age-wise and maternal education level-wise, they look very similar to the monolingual children, and in fact they look very similar to the monolingual children in everything, except for the fact that they're actually not exposed to English as much, right? If you take a look at the 3rd column, these are the children we typically worry about when we think about diagnosing language impairment. So these are kids who speak Spanish as their native language. They're acquiring English largely in the home, largely in the school context, right? So up until about 5 years of age, they were entirely Spanish dominant, and then they go to school and they start learning English. And at that point, if you're trying to figure out if poor English skills are somehow reflective of an impaired system, that's where the difficulties come in, right? In terms of age and IQ, you can see that, they're quite similar to the monolingual kids and the simultaneous bilingual kids. If you look at maternal education, this is proxy for socioeconomic status that's very often used in studies of child language development. You can see that these kids have lower SES than the other 2 groups. This is sort of an inherent aspect of this population. These are 1st, 2nd generation immigrant children. Typically, the families, Latino, Hispanic families in the United States, typically have lower levels of education, lower income levels, a more blue-collar professional sort of status. And so this is what the population is. There's nothing you can do about it. And you can see that, the exposure to Spanish has actually happened for these kids earlier than the exposure to English. And in terms of Spanish exposure, they get a bit more of it than the simultaneous bilingual children. So there are lots of differences between these 2 groups. So what I'm going to show you when I show you the data, it's going to be really hard to tell what the difference is being driven by. because ages of acquisition are different, exposure levels are different, and then, these are vocabulary performance data, and you can see that these are different as well.
Rita, can you say a word about the simultaneous bilingual? So what kind of background, who are these kids?
So typically, these kids have parents who one parent speaks one language and the other parent speaks the other language. So these are typically what we see within the simultaneous population. Whereas for the Spanish L1 kids, typically both parents are Spanish-speaking parents. The simultaneous bilingual children are kind of an interesting population because there are fluctuations. So some of these kids actually come from situations where the nanny was the Spanish speaker in the home and both parents were actually monolingual English speakers. So that has happened as well. Yeah. So we gave our kids vocabulary measures, which we always do. So we measured their English vocabulary skills and their Spanish vocabulary skills. And up in the top graph, I'm showing you English performance levels, right? So monolinguals are in blue, simultaneous bilinguals are in red, and then Spanish L1 kids are in green. And you can see this really nice, right, staircase pattern where the monolinguals are doing really, really well. The simultaneous bilingual children are doing quite well, but not as well as the monolingual kids. And the kids who are doing the task clearly in their second language are doing poorly on this task. Now, it's important to say that in terms of averages, right, these are standard scores. So 100 is the mean. The standard deviation is 15. So if you define your normal range of performance as 1.5 to 2 standard deviations around the mean, no one is below the mean, right? But it is important to say that within the Spanish L1 group, there were some kids with English scores that would actually place them into that range of impairment, right? If you were just relying on monolingual norms. Does that make sense? Yeah. And so, in terms of Spanish vocabulary measures, this was actually kind of a nice thing that happened. Our two bilingual groups actually have very similar levels of knowledge of Spanish, right? Despite differences in acquisition histories and exposure dynamics, in terms of what they actually know in Spanish, they look very, very similar. So if you think back to these models of working memory that we started out with, and if you think that working memory function is very much an outcome of what you know about the language, these differences in English language proficiency should give you very clear predictions as to what you should expect on working memory measures, right? So you should expect the monolingual kids to do really well, followed by the simultaneous bilingual kids, followed by the Spanish L1 kids, right?
Can you say something about the test in Spanish? Is it equivalent to the
Equivalent, yes. So the TVIT is the Spanish correlate to the PPVT, and then the expressive measures were actually taken from the Woodcock-Johnson test of achievement and cognitive development. And the nice thing about the Woodcock-Johnson is that they were actually developed and normed in parallel in English and in Spanish. So this is just a simple picture naming task. The kids are naming pictures in English, and in the Spanish version, they're naming different pictures that were normed for Spanish in Spanish. Yeah. We can talk about how good I think these measures are at some point, maybe tomorrow. So we actually had done much more with these kids than the two tasks I'll show you, but these tasks I think give kind of a very interesting contrast to the adult data, so I'm just going to focus on them. So again, using a very straightforward distinction between short-term memory and working memory, right? The short-term memory task is a word span task. You hear a list of words, you need to repeat them in the same order as you heard them, and as always, we manipulate the difficulty level of the task, right? And then verbal working memory, we measured using the listening span. This is a very traditional version, right, of a working memory task. Kids listen to a sentence. They need to decide if the sentence is true or false, if it makes sense or not, right? Buses have wheels. So buses have wheels, yes. You know, pumpkins are purple, no. And then recall the two words that you heard. So a child needs to say wheels, purple, right? And so the task sort of builds up in terms of difficulty level, and what you do is you make lists longer, right? So the easy level of the task, 1 sentence, right? The difficult level of the task, 6 sentences. So these are the tasks, and we only did them in English, which in hindsight was a stupid idea, but that's what we did. All right, so these are the data. So I'm plotting word span data first, right? You hear a list of words, you need to retrieve them. And on the y-axis, it's just proportion correct. On the x-axis is list length, right? In green are the Spanish L1 kids. In red are the simultaneous bilingual kids, and in blue are the monolingual kids, right? So the first thing is that the difficulty manipulation works for everyone, which is great, right? So easy is easy for everyone. Now, the difference between monolingual children and the Spanish L1 kids is there pretty much for all the levels of the task except the most difficult level of the task, right? So at 8-word level, all groups actually perform similarly to each other, but one could argue it's because they floor out. The task gets so difficult that everyone just fails it, right? I mean, you know, you could also argue that 0.25 is actually not a failing rate, but you know, it's a fair argument. But what's interesting is the simultaneous bilingual data. So the simultaneous bilingual children are actually doing similarly to the monolingual children, at least at the easier levels of the task. And it's interesting because in terms of vocabulary knowledge, they do less well than the monolingual children. But when you make the task more about processing and less about retrieving word meanings, the differences between groups tend to get smaller, which is nice. I mean, that's the whole point about using these types of tasks to get at language. The problem is that the simultaneous bilingual children are not the children we worry about in terms of misclassifying and misdiagnosing. It's the Spanish L1 kids that we worry about. And for the Spanish L1 kids, you can see that bilingual monolingual gap is just there, right? On a word span task, on a task that supposedly is savvy processing capacity rather than word knowledge, differences in language skills, right, really you cannot step over them, right? If you think back to the adult data, this is very different, right? So our adult bilinguals were also tested in their L2, which was very clearly less proficient than the monolinguals' language skills. And yet when we upped the difficulty levels of the task, we actually, in fact, showed bilingual advantages, right? Here you can see that you never cross that threshold, right? In childhood, somehow it doesn't work the same way, right? And then, you know, if you do it with the working memory data, which you might think would be more apt to close the gap between bilinguals and monolinguals, you can see that that doesn't happen either. So the monolinguals do better than the bilinguals, and they certainly do way, way better than the Spanish L1 bilingual children. So even a task like a working memory task that is really more about attention, right, and less about long-term knowledge, if the task is verbal in nature, right, in childhood, language knowledge trumps everything.
I would argue that if you did a sentence span for your Korean adults, they would bomb out as well. Because I think it taps language in a more complex way.
I think that's
because it's about the syntax and the meaning. I mean, I don't know, it's a prediction, but I think the listening span and the reading span.
I think it's
I
very true. I actually have not listening span, reading span data for adults that I'll show you.
And I think listening span is even worse than reading span.
Listening span is really hard.
It's really hard.
It's really hard because you basically have to process things
Online, and reading span, I mean, you can go back.
You
so-
can.
I'm not even sure I like listening span as a working memory. I've never used it.
Well, so here's the thing. In monolinguals, listening span and reading span do exactly the same thing. That's the thing. In bilinguals, maybe not, or in L2 speakers.
Yeah.
So anyway, so the point is that, you know, the proficiency stuff really matters for children. It does so much more than for adults. So there's something about the developmental pathway and the dynamics between attention and long-term knowledge of language that works differently in kids than it does in adults. And for the purposes of diagnosis, this is actually kind of interesting and discouraging. It kind of really says that in terms of developing processing-based measures, if these measures are language-based, you're going to have a very tough time designing a task that would actually wipe out bilingual, monolingual differences, right?
What they want to say, these are the clinical stuff here, is that actually the experience is now a lot with Russian-speaking children. We use measures from what's the
Working memory, battery.
Together.
And the kids are very, very, very low. And what we guess now is that we cannot.
And the judgment, but all the children are very low in this test.
So children, so the L2 speakers.
Yes.
And
The
I think all
no.
the children are very low in this test and not in the backward digit span.
Yeah, so
We
actually
stopped to use it because
You can't really, from a diagnostic point of view, you can't really infer that you're talking
about
working
memory would use
I
it.
absolutely agree with you, and it's actually at this point, people have shown this across various languages and various age groups. The thing is that people typically don't look at adults, right, in relation to these kinds of data, and they should, because it actually looks different in adults than it does in kids. But in kids, this is very consistent. So if you have a task that's in any way linguistic in nature,
Yeah, we have to think
Yeah.
about our tests.
Yeah.
But what,
Ray.
how do you measure sentence
Ray.
repetition accuracy only if the child repeats all the words within the sentence?
No. So the way that the listening span task works is that you hear a sentence, and for children, you basically have to decide if the sentence is true or false, and you have to remember the last word of the sentence. So it's just like a word span in the sense that your measure of recall is a single word level measure. But what makes it a working memory measure is the processing of syntactic and semantic information.
Would you suggest that we translate, for example, the Ray auditory measure
They don't speak
to
very
Russian?
good in Russian.
I think translating tests is just in general a bad idea.
Well, go down with create a Russian
Creating, I mean, here's the thing, okay, in terms of standard of care, right, when you do assessments for bilingual children, there are things that you do, right? One thing that you do, and one argument is you should always do it in the native language. You should never do it in a second language, right? That's one argument. The problem with that argument is that the norms are not available for a lot of the time. So what do you do with those data once you get it? Like, what do you compare that to, right? So there's no easy solution, right? Another thing is to say, do it in both languages. And if there is a clear discrepancy where the kids are way better in the native language than the second language, chances are you're not looking at language impairment.
Mm-hmm.
Chances are you're looking at typical development and second language proficiency issues.
Mm-hmm.
The problem is designing a task in the native language that's similar in difficulty level as the task in the second language is really hard, because what's difficult for one system is not going to be difficult for the other. Case in point for SLI, right? In English, it's all about tense markings. That's what it is. Most people will tell you, right? So to diagnose SLI in English, you need to demonstrate some sort of a grammatical weakness. And in English-speaking monolingual children, it's all about the past tense, right? Mabel Rice, right? It's all about the past tense. In a lot of languages, it's really not about the past tense.
Yes, but you cannot. You always have norms within the language, so you can always test, even if the tests are different. whether the specific ability in the L2 or L1 is compatible with the norms.
I absolutely
So-
agree
If
with
you
you.
have the norms.
Except what
And I
is-
think
right.
it's even more difficult because a simultaneous bilingual wouldn't be the same as a monolingual Spanish speaker,
Right.
because he's only getting half the exposure in Spanish. So those norms aren't good
Yeah.
either.
So how, for example, speech therapists analyze SLI among Russian speaking children?
It's very different, difficult. Sometimes Russian speaker speech therapist test them in Russian, but there is problem with the norms. But we always say that if you have a problem in Hebrew, you anyway need to help them in Hebrew. So it doesn't matter.
I think in the
It's
States it's a
original.
big issue because a lot of funding and support is tied to whether you have a diagnosis or not.
Well, the thing is that you cannot get services
If you're not
through the public school system unless you have a formal diagnosis of language impairment. A speech pathologist will not make a formal diagnosis, right, without some sort of a reference to a norm. And then it becomes this really bad cycle where kids either go undiagnosed and untreated, which is bad. But the other problem is they go overdiagnosed. And then what ends up happening is that they end up getting services for something that they do not need. So the time that they could be spending in the classroom learning English is the time that they spend in a speech pathologist's office getting drilled on the ED past tense, right? So it's a big, I'm sure it's just as big of a problem here as it is there. But the fact of the matter is that we're doing actually quite well with Spanish-speaking kids in the States. Still not quite solving the problem of monolingual norms in Spanish are actually really not appropriate, right, for bilingual children who speak Spanish and another language. But the fact of the matter is, if you have a child who is doing okay in relation to the monolingual norms in English and in relation to the monolingual norms in Spanish,
That's fine.
it's great, right? The other thing is that at this point we have enough research in the States to document what the typical path of English language acquisition is for typically developing children who speak Spanish as the native language. So you know that a child who has primarily been exposed to Spanish in the home gets to preschool, right, at around age 5, and from age 5 to 8, there's a certain amount of English that they need to be able to acquire, right? So within that window, there's some inconsistency, but by the time they've had 3 years of consistent exposure to English, you expect certain benchmarks to be reached. When they're not reached, you suspect a SLI, right, or whatever, a learning disability. Problem is, we don't actually have that for all the other languages in the States. And the timeline that works for Spanish-speaking kids is not necessarily the timeline that's going to work from kids who come from different cultures and different linguistic societies. So it's a huge problem. I mean, it's really overwhelmingly difficult to make diagnoses of language impairment within the situation, and it's beyond the issues of diagnosis. Treatment-wise, we actually don't know what to do with these kids because there's actually very little empirical data for bilingual treatment versus monolingual treatment. What's better, what's worse? Family dynamics matter hugely in the States. And so it's a huge problem. I mean, we're just kind of scraping the surface, honestly.
Have you tried this with the visual working?
Yeah, so let me show you that very quickly. All right. So I'm just going to skip over this and then tell you that, we think that it's really productive to think about language knowledge and centralized attentional control when thinking about verbal memory and bilingualism. But where it gets really interesting is if you kind of shift away from language, right? And there is, if you can believe that, there's actually even less work on nonverbal working memory in bilinguals, which is kind of interesting because there's so much work on executive function and bilingualism. And a lot of people will think of working memory as a very important aspect of executive functioning. No one really studies this, and people who do it very tangentially. There are a few studies. So this is the Luo study that actually showed bilingual advantages on a nonverbal working memory task. Now, the fun thing about this is that these are the same participants who showed disadvantages on the verbal versions of the task. And they're now actually showing advantages on the spatial working memory tasks. And so these were the Corsi blocks, which I'll show you in just a second. There are a few studies now that have shown totally neutral effects of bilingualism on nonverbal working memory. So this is a study, they looked at the symbol span, kind of like a counting span, but with visual symbols, and showed absolutely no differences between bilinguals and monolinguals on this task. So we kind of got into this thinking that difficulty probably matters. And so I'm just going to show you some very preliminary data on visual working memory function, spatial working memory function in bilingual adults, and then I'll show you the keto data. So this is the NBAC task that Anat was asking about, right? So the NBAC task is actually really hard because you need to constantly update information in memory, and the buffer basically needs to be wiped out with every presentation of a new stimulus. Our goal, and this is what Rama was asking about, was to actually design a task that would be as non-linguistic as we could possibly make it, which is a real challenge. What we ended up doing is we ended up using a visual NBAC, and we used these shapes. These are actually pretty famous visual shapes that were designed in the 70s. They have very low linguistic association indices. So these were actually normed. They had a whole lot of people look at these little like ink blots basically and ask them to say, what do you think of when you see this? Can you think of a name, right? And people said like snowflake, you know, something. And the shapes that had the lowest semantic values, those were the ones that we used, right? So these should have very low linguistic associations for individuals. And we had 3 conditions. So in the zero back condition, you're basically looking for a target shape. We show you a shape and say, every time you see this shape, press a key, right? Every time it's a different shape, press the other key. It's a very simple task. You just need to keep one shape in mind, right? In the one back condition, what you're doing is you're looking for a shape that's exactly the shape that came one position before, right? So if you get 2 of these in a row, right, you go yes. If it's different from the one before, you say no. In the 2 back condition, which is the most difficult level of this, you're tracking, right, a shape that appeared 2 positions before, right? So this is a 2 back condition. So in this track, you would say that this is a no because it's the first one, nothing came before it. This is a no because it's nothing is there. This is a no because it's not the same as this. But this is a yes because it's the same as this one. It's a really hard task. Just to kind of show you guys how hard it is, this is what it would actually look like, right? And they go pretty fast, right? And so it's actually a really,
Show us
really...
Can you test it again? Although we know that just to...
Yeah, it's hard. So you basically, what you would do is you'd say no, 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 yes. Right? And then no, 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 yes. And it gets really, it's a tough task to do. Tough to do with adults. We're actually trying to do this with kids. Which
How old are the kids or were the kids?
I'm going to show you the kid data in just a second. The kids that you can do this, so you cannot do this with a 5-year-old. You cannot do it with a 6-year-old. You can't do it with an 8-year-old and a 9-year-old.
6-year-olds do the one back?
Yeah, sometimes, maybe. Yeah. So these are adult data. So these are young adults. We have monolinguals and bilinguals. These are actually, I think we're back to Korean speakers here. Yeah. So, and you can see, you know, pretty good sort of matching on groups in terms of age and nonverbal IQ, the English level abilities are stronger in the monolinguals than the bilinguals. These are the data. I didn't plot it. I'll plot it in just a second. But you can see here that there are like no differences between bilinguals and monolinguals on the NBAC. The nice thing is that the difficulty levels are kind of weird. Well, I don't know if it's nice or not. But it's like people are actually doing better on the 1 back than they're doing on the 0 back, which is kind of odd. But everyone is doing less well on the 2 back than the 1 back, and then the 0
I
Uh,
back.
guess the zero back, it's something that you have to maintain in memory and keep comparing to that, whereas the 1 back
Yes,
is more.
and that's what people would argue, is that those 0 back is not actually an updating task. It's like a sustained attention kind of task.
What is the zero back?
You have you're shown a target shape,
I-
and you're told every time you see it, just press a key.
It's like
Yeah. So, you could look at it and say bilingualism has nothing to do with visual working memory, which is actually kind of nice for the assessment type questions, right? And I'll show you why in just a second. So these are kids. So for kids, we do 2 different nonverbal memory tasks. We do the Corsi block and we do the NBAC. The Corsi blocks is kind of a neat task. So they're told to look at the screen, and on the screen shapes light up in different order, like this. And then with the mouse, they're shown a blank one, and they need to click exactly the sequence that they saw, right? And so the difficulty level is manipulated by increasing the number of things that light up. And then the NBAC, we actually changed the administration of it for the kids. So there's this really long and intricate set of instructions that have to be given to them, and then they have to practice, and you have to reinforce it, and they still have a tough time with it. The thing about this is that, these are nonverbal tasks, right? Yes, nonverbal in the sense that
The only way I can do it is by naming it as an animal.
well, and not only that, right? So there's a strategy there, and not only that, but in order to explain to the child what to do, you have to use language, and they have to understand it, right? So they are nonverbal in the sense that the stimuli are nonverbal, but your instructions are. And the strategy. So our adults, this was actually really funny. The adults who do this task give these shapes state names. So you'll get things like Wisconsin, Florida, Ohio. Right? Yeah. So okay. So these are the child data. So we are testing children who are older. So these are kids between the ages of 9 and 11. And we have 3 groups of children here. So we have the monolingual kids as our baseline. We have the simultaneous bilingual children. We'll also get the Spanish L1 kids at some point. It's just that those kids are precious to us. They are the ones that are the most difficult to recruit for us. We don't want to waste them. So we're because we're still playing with the paradigms, we're not recruiting them yet, but we're recruiting all the other bilinguals. These are the classroom bilinguals, which is actually a really cool group of bilingual children that we're starting to test. So these are kids who are growing up with English as their native language. There's no other language spoken in the home. But then when they get to school, the parents decide to put them into a dual immersion classroom. So all of a sudden, these kids who had never heard Spanish a day in their life are placed into a classroom where 90% of instruction is actually conducted in Spanish, and where half of the class consists of native Spanish-speaking kids. So this is a way that the American educational system is dealing with English as a second language issue in the schools. So it's an interesting group to contrast, because in terms of English language knowledge, they look very, very similar to the monolingual children, but they're getting additional second language exposure. And you can see that, IQ-wise, these kids look quite similar, but language-wise, the simultaneous bilingual children are doing less well than the monolingual children, and also less well than the classroom bilingual children. And socioeconomically, right, the simultaneous bilingual kids actually come from lower SES than the other two groups of kids. Okay, so these are the Corsi block data. And it doesn't look like anything, right? But it actually is something. So the monolinguals are in blue, the simultaneous bilinguals are in red, and the classroom bilinguals are in green. And then the number correct, which is, how many of those squares did they actually manage to pick out correctly in the right order, that's the y-axis. So the good news is that the difficulty manipulation works, right? Everyone does better with easier tasks. It doesn't look like there are group differences here, right? Except for the fact that it's actually really hard to see what happens at the more difficult levels of the task. So I'm actually going to zero in on it, and I'm going to zero in on the monolingual, simultaneous, bilingual data, because that's actually the most interesting data. So ignore the yellow for now, and just look at the blue, which is your monolinguals, and the red, which are your simultaneous bilinguals. So at the more difficult levels of the task, where you have 6 of these locations to remember and 7 of these locations to remember, the simultaneous bilingual children are actually doing a little better than the monolingual children. Remember how they varied in SES, right? And the bilingual kids actually came from lower SES than the monolingual kids. If you statistically account for that difference, right, you just co-vary SES out, you actually end up with statistically significant differences between the bilingual and the monolingual children, with the bilingual children actually doing better, right? One could argue that this is an executive control, executive function type advantage. It has nothing to do with working memory. These are the visual end-back data. I don't know what is going on with the classroom bilingual kids. They just bomb the N-2. But the simultaneous bilingual children and the monolingual children are doing exactly the same thing. And thinking back to diagnosis, right? This has actually been an argument that Kathy Conard has been making for a very long time, that specific language impairment, given that it's not very specific, right? I think everyone would agree with that kids with SLI don't just have problems with language, right? They also have problems with a whole lot of other things like procedural memory, inhibitory control, working memory, et cetera, et cetera. Given that, right, perhaps language measures are not the way to go when trying to figure out if a bilingual child has a language impairment. Maybe we should go more domain general and non-linguistic. And these data, I think, are kind of promising in that regard. Because what we're seeing here is that the bilingual kids who are doing less well than the monolingual kids on the language measures are actually doing very similarly, if not better, than the monolingual children on the nonverbal measures. What needs to happen at this point is administration of these tasks to bilingual kids with SLI and monolingual kids with SLI to actually look at the 4-way contrast. We haven't done it yet. Other people
Sharon
have.
has a student doing this in Balilan, Sharon Lotam. She has a student looking exactly at the language and the executive function. And I think what she's finding, if I remember correctly, is that the bilingual SLI kids, who are, I guess, diagnosed on the basis of their language, are matching the monolingual typical development kids in terms of executive function. I hope I'm not messing it up, but I think, so the monolingual SLI kids were doing really bad on everything, and on some of the measures, the bilingual SLI kids were actually doing better.
But that's actually an argument against using these measures for diagnostic purposes, right? Because when you look at just nonverbal performance and you see comparable levels of performance in bilingual and monolingual children, you may actually be looking at some sort of a compensatory mechanism, right? So you may actually miss a diagnosis of language impairment.
But potentially the difficulty manipulation is the way to go.
That's
Because
exactly.
if you tap like less difficult tasks where there are no differences and still the SLI kids would look different. and
That's
then
exactly
they would,
right. Yeah. So I'm still not quite, part of the, here's the, for us, the biggest problem is, and this is, you know, there's no one to blame for it but me, is that we're doing this in very small bits and pieces with different children and different tasks and different populations. Really, the way to do this, really, is to take a population, right, and manipulate language ability and diagnostic status and age within that population, and then administer tasks that are linguistic and non-linguistic that are parallel to each other, right, to try and get to this somehow. The problem is that, you know, equating difficulty levels in a verbal versus nonverbal task is not a trivial matter, and making a task appropriate for children, adolescents, young adults, older adults is actually not trivial either. But we're working on it. One thing that I think is kind of neat is to think of working memory, and this is not going to take me very long. I think this is probably what people are most excited about. You know, so thinking of working memory not as an end goal in itself, but as a cognitive sort of foundation for a language functioning. And a lot of people think of language processing as very much constrained by the working memory abilities. So for those of us who are interested in syntactic processing, reading comprehension, listening comprehension, narrative construction and narrative understanding, right? You always have to think about working memory, right? And the reason why this is started in the 80s actually, right? With this very famous paper that Daneman and Carpenter put out, where they were actually the first ones to introduce the reading span task as a measure of working memory. And the reason why it has become so popular is because they demonstrated that the relationship between performance on the reading span and performance on language processing type tasks, they did like a narrative-based pronoun resolution type task. It was actually a much closer relationship than between a short-term memory measure like a word span, right, and that same text-based processing. So they said in order to process complex language, it's not about your short-term memory. It's about your working memory.
Or your ability to process complex language.
Right. So the classic, right? So the classic finding is that you know, individuals with higher working memory, as measured by the reading span, they actually do better on these complex syntactic-based sentence processing type tasks than individuals with a lower reading span. Another way of doing this is another very famous paper, this is the King and Just paper, where they split participants up into high span and low span based on their reading span data, and then they examined the length of time that people took to silently read sentences with various degrees of complexities, finding consistently that lower span individuals took more time, right, to process syntactic information than the higher span individuals. This particular paper I really like because it actually shows how higher working memory capacity can work against you, which I think is kind of an interesting way to think about it. So this was Mary Ellen McDonald's first paper. And so what they did, Tamara knows this paper, right? So what they did is they actually manipulated how ambiguous or unambiguous sentence constructions were in English. So in the unambiguous sentences, there's only one way to interpret a relative clause, and then in the ambiguous sentences, you could attach the relative clause to the main verb or to the secondary verb, right? And so the thing is that frequency-wise, right, minimal attachment is the way to go. That's the way English actually typically works. But what they've shown is that individuals with high working memory span actually activated both attachments. And so when they had to read sentences where the sort of the first interpretation was the correct one, it actually slowed them down compared to people with lower working memory spans. So in a lot of ways, people with lower working memory spans, because they don't activate both syntactic structures, had an easier time of it because the more canonical structure was usually the right one, right? Okay, so then the problem is, of course, and this is what Anat was alluding to, if you look at how you measure working memory in these studies, right, this is a reading span task. These are the sentences taken precisely from the Carpenter and Just kind of tasks. You read a sentence out loud, remember the last word. Self-paced reading tasks, lexical decision, syntactic ambiguity, resolution type tasks, you read the sentence and you do something with it. You read sentences, right? In both of these tasks, that's what you're doing. And so when you find relationships between them, it may have nothing to do with your working memory and everything to do with the fact that you're processing language in both tasks. So, you correlated language with language, and what does that give you? And so Mary Ellen MacDonald was actually one of the first people to say, this is a problem, and she has gone on to then say there's no such thing as working memory, right? She had a very radical kind of solution to the issue. She said, there's no such thing as working memory, it's all about language. But the solution may actually be something that, again, it's the Engel group that's been arguing this. What they have been arguing is that verbal memory and nonverbal memory, really that division of labor matters for short-term memory tasks only, for the easier levels of the task. If you look at the working memory tasks, if you scale up the difficulty level, then the relationship between verbal and nonverbal memory measures becomes very, very tight, on the order of 0.8, right? And they actually tend to cluster together in factor analyses. So a solution to this problem then, if you're interested in working memory, right, as the mechanism that supports language processing, a solution to this measurement problem is to say, well, let's not measure working memory in a linguistic domain, let's measure it in a non-linguistic domain, and then look at the relationship between performance on that task and a performance on your syntactic processing task, which I think is a really cool idea.
But then it won't correlate as well.
Here's the problem with it. Thank you. Okay, so we're actually getting at this. This is actually, again, I think part of it is going to be Ji-won's dissertation. So the end goal is to link verbal and nonverbal working memory measures to syntactic processing. But a first step here is to actually link visual and verbal working memory in bilinguals versus monolinguals to see if they actually do go together or don't go together. And again, this will kind of speak to the diagnostic issues, right? So we're using a reading span task to measure verbal memory, and we're using the NBAG to measure the visual memory. We basically, this is a very traditional reading span task, so participants read sentences out loud on the screen. At an easier level of the task, you just read it out loud and then you have to say ticket, right? At the more difficult level of the task, you read this out loud, you read this out loud, you read this out loud, and then you have to remember the last 3 words, right? Whatever that was, professor, bottle. Yeah, clearly I'm not very good at this. Okay, so we have some data for monolinguals and bilinguals. These are adults. These are the reading span data, right? And what you're seeing here is the effect of language proficiency on performance. Bilinguals are doing it in their L2. They're not doing as well as the monolinguals, right? And especially at the more difficult level of the task, which is something we've seen before. So this all makes sense. These are the visual NBAG data, just visually, just to show you what they are. And these are the same reading span data I just showed you, just graphed next to each other. So there's actually, it looks like there's a difference, but it's actually not statistically significant for the reading span. And then on the NBAG, there's no difference between bilinguals and monolinguals. But what we then did is we used the visual data to split individuals up into high visual working memory and low visual working memory. And that's just participant information. So if you believe the Engel group, right, the visual and the verbal working memory should really work together. So people with good visual working memory should also be good on the reading span task. And for monolinguals, it does work that way. So the solid is high visual working memory, people who are really, really good at the NBAG, right? And the dashed line are people who really are bad at the NBAC. And what you can see is that people who are good at the NBAC are also good at the reading span. People who are bad at the NBAC are also really bad on the reading span. And this is especially true as the task gets more difficult, because yeah, right, you know, it's becoming much more domain general, attentional resources are being recruited. So the monolingual data really are nice, and you can actually look at this and say, well, because they tend to track together, right, maybe there's virtue in using these visual working memory tasks to index typicality of the working memory system, which should then maybe be a good cue as to the normalcy of linguistic and cognitive development. Here's the problem. These are the bilingual data. It actually, I mean, not only are the differences between high and low visual working memory groups not significant, they actually reverse. And so
What was the cutoff of good and bad?
we just median split them. So we looked at the visual NBAC performance, found a median for each group, and split them down the middle. Yeah. So, you know, what do you do with this, right? I'm not sure. I mean, we basically at this point, interpretation-wise, where one kind of is led is to argue that the working memory system is perhaps a bit more non-modality specific in monolinguals and is perhaps a bit more segregated by modality for bilinguals who are doing the verbal task in their second language, right? Maybe it's a second language versus the native language issue. But the fact of the matter is that this poses big difficulties for diagnostic type conclusions. Because if they don't go together in bilinguals, right, then using any sort of nonverbal performance to argue typicality of language becomes a problem.
I guess I'm not sure why it's a problem diagnostically. Because if we've already said that the verbal working memory tasks are problematic, right?
Mm-hmm.
We would actually want them to not work together for bilinguals. We'd want the visual working memory to be its own separate thing that could potentially diagnose SLI versus not, right?
But it's then really hard because then you're using different criteria to diagnose language in bilinguals versus monolinguals, which may actually be the way to go, right? What you could argue, and some people have argued that bilingual minds are just different from monolingual minds. And using monolingual data as your anchor point for any kind of comparison is actually faulty logic. One shouldn't do that. But then you need to create bilingual norms, right? Because how else are you going to make your diagnoses? But then are you going to make different norms depending on
Age of
acquisition,
length of
exposure,
But I
proficiency?
think in the Israeli context, everyone will be bilingual.
Right.
In all of us are bilingual
Yeah.
in some way.
Yeah. Well, you know,
So-
some would argue that in the States, finding pure monolinguals is also.
It's interesting what you're saying because I'm thinking about Esther Geva's work,
Mhm.
who looks at reading difficulties.
Yep.
And what she has found now consistently over many years is that in basic processes, the expectation is the same. You know, given a year or two of instruction, kids should be able to do basic decoding. And if they're not, then there's a problem.
Yeah.
So she says, you know, I keep seeing differences in vocabulary, I keep seeing differences in syntax, but something about the basic process is either intact or impaired.
Yeah.
And I'm kind of wondering whether there could be a correlate of that for language and not for literacy.
I'm not sure.
I'm not sure.
I'm not sure. Yeah. So, you know, we're still very interested in figuring this out.
There's some high school kids outside.
I would assume so. So yeah, I mean, I don't know what to make of this. I will just kind of tell you that but this is sort of where we are in our thinking as we kind of go on to think about what to do with these data and what to do research-wise and what to do clinically. And no matter what your goal is with using working memory measures, whether it is to make some sort of a diagnostic decision or to covary out working memory capacity in your group comparisons, or to use it as an individual differences predictor for other things that you're interested in, I think that all of the things, the developmental appropriateness, difficulty level of the task, the role that language proficiency versus cognitive function will play in sort of driving your working memory performance, all of these things matter, but I think the one lesson that I have learned in all of this is that you should never ever use a single measure of working memory, ever. And even two is not enough. So just to kind of give you a case in point, this is actually, so Akira Miyake has been doing working memory executive function work for over like 20 years. And he once told me that across all of his studies, using exactly the same tasks to look at visual memory or spatial memory and verbal memory, he has had correlations between tasks across studies from 0.2, non-significant, to 0.8, abundantly significant. Same tasks, same populations, college students, right? So these things fluctuate enormously, and we don't actually know what the fluctuations are being driven by. And so one approach that has been really advocated, which is actually a lot easier to implement research-wise than clinically, is to do some sort of a latent variable analysis on your data. So you can have 6 or 7 different measures of memory that you think measure memory, and then you need to administer it to a whole lot of people, and then you need to look at common variance between them. And it's that common variance that's going to be the best index of working memory.
Which, makes sense if you're studying working memory, but if you just need to use this for something else, that's completely nuts.
It is completely nuts, but the problem is that if you just pick a measure,
You're gonna be,
so our kind of default has been, if we're interested in working memory as a predictor, we'll typically use a complex span measure, and we'll typically manipulate the difficulty level of it, because that way we hope to kind of cover a spectrum of abilities, which I think is really important. But so, at this point,
so you guys always use 2?
We try to use 2, we use 2.
So what, the digits?
The digit span, backward digit span, and then you have to count dots, and then you have to say the order. Yeah, that we use for We took out the sentence and the judgment task. We took
Yes.
it out. Yeah.
Yeah. So, and then the extent to which visual memory is actually impaired in SLI is a big, big debate, right? So Susan Gathergold has data that says they're not impaired. And then, I have seen data that says, yes, it is impaired, right? The extent to which tasks like non-word repetition can supersede language knowledge discrepancies is also a huge question, right? So there are Campbell data suggesting that, dialect speakers can do just as well on a non-word repetition task as mainstream speakers of the language, despite differences in vocabulary knowledge. That's one thing. And then there's a huge bilingual literature showing that bilingual kids tested in their L2 do less well on non-word repetition tasks than the monolingual children. Yeah. So it's
It is what it is.
it is what it's a very complex construct. It really is. And people who don't spend their lives obsessing over it
Don't have anything.
Exactly. And so that's why the discrepancies across studies. It's sort of an invariable outcome of variability of measures and populations, and yeah. So I don't know, helpful.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Rita's still going to be around for a couple weeks, so if you want to meet with her, pick her brain, discuss thoughts, I'm sure she'll be happy to.
Yeah,
And tell her about some of your stuff.
that would be great. Yeah,
She's right here.
yeah, right.
I think actually that's her office.
Yeah, I think that's my window.
And she's going to be giving another talk on Thursday to the HLF more language.
No working, well, a little bit of work.
Thanks for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, invite.